What's up, my friends? It's Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And back in the mid-2000s, there was a director. Well, I mean, he's still alive. So there's still a director named Edgar Wright. And at that point, he would have been a really young guy. I mean, he's not 50 now. So it was just kind of an epiphany for me. Yeah, he was a kid when he was coming up with a whole new approach to directorial, editorial comedy. He did Hot Fuzz, Shaun of the Dead. And the jokes they're visual. It's the way the camera whips around. It's the way you cut to the next thing so that the joke comes off of the verbal cue, and the two sort of work in tandem as though the editor or the camera is part of a comedy duo. It's just a fun way to edit. I think he was on Ant-Man at the beginning as well, and most of the funny stuff in Ant-Man, I think, was Edgar Wright. All of that to say, this comedic directorial style influenced a whole bunch of other people. And one of the shows that I think really latched on to Edgar Wright's style in the early 2010s was the movie adaptation of the TV show 21 Jump Street, which was pretty funny. And as usual, the official policy of this program is that I don't recommend that you watch anything ever at all, because all of it is bad and disturbing. But in this show that I highly don't recommend, there's this one really funny directorial style joke, editing style joke that they tell, where they're on this big car chase through traffic, and all of these things keep happening that should cause stuff to explode. And it plays off of the old trope that the audience is used to, where something that should explode gets hit with a thing, and then there's music, and then it gets quiet, and then you expect the theater rocking explosion as everything ramps up. And so he kept doing that. Then like gasoline trucks are getting hit with things like dun 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 dun. But then it just doesn't explode at all. It's delightful. And then after like 3 of those, wow, how did that not explode kind of moments, then like a balloon hits a chicken truck or something and it explodes. I don't remember the exact joke, but riffing on the trope and especially the change of pace is what made it super funny. Likewise, in Matthew chapter 22, we are getting one of those ramp-ups where it feels like we got a runaway car speeding toward a big tanker full of fuel, and we get the ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. But then it doesn't explode, and instead it's just this nice little interlude, this nice little oasis where instead it's like, no, here's a reasonable question, and okay, well, here's a reasonable answer, and everybody's like, well, that was pretty good. And then we just get right back to fighting about things after that. So the passage that we've been talking about is this one with the Pharisee who is unnamed, but we're pretty sure his name is probably Glenn. And so Matthew 22, verse 34, it says, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, Glenn, tested him with this question, Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. And then as we discussed the other day, if you flip over to the corresponding passage in Mark's account gives us this additional detail where Glenn says, well said, teacher. You're right in saying that God is one and there is no other but him. To love him with all your heart, with all your understanding, with all your strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. And Jesus saw that he'd answered wisely. He said to him, you're not far from the kingdom of God. So first of all, and most simply, I feel like there's a bit of a telling detail here and maybe a touch of a parable for our times. How refreshing is it when everything ramps up and it looks like we're going to go nuclear again with our broken discourse and then somebody just doesn't? I have enormous respect for the people who just don't. Please pardon the brief upcoming rant, but the reality is there are so many people who are so financially invested in you hating half of the people you share a country and half of the people you share a planet with. They dump all kinds of money into understanding how our brains work and what it takes to get us riled up and upset, what generates clicks. And we all fall for it. I mean, all of us. And the only off-ramp is to start cherishing things like this, where there's a degree of humanity and ability to interact with an idea calmly and with reason. And here to be like, yeah, okay, even though my tribe is supposed to be burning you down right now, yeah, what you just said is true. That's good. Yes, we should love God and we should love others. And that does kind of summarize the whole thing, doesn't it? The refreshing feeling that we get as we read this interlude is a refreshing feeling that we all have the ability to give away to other people we encounter every day. And I don't know, as mad as we all are about things, maybe it's time to just be more like Glenn. And just lay down our arms from time to time and be vulnerable and be human and acknowledge rightness and decency and good when we see it on other people, even if we don't agree with every other single thing they think. But beyond that, there's a much larger truth claim here than just the exemplary, and that is Jesus saying that loving God with everything you got and loving your neighbor like you love yourself, that sums up the entire law and the prophets. And that is a pretty bold claim, and I want to take the rest of the little bit of time we have here to process that through before we move on to the next passage. To do that, I guess I want to work backwards through Jesus' remarks here. So starting at the end, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. All right, well, what's the point of all the law and the prophets based on everything you've read in the book of Matthew to this point? You know what? This is going to be a little bit of a Dora the Explorer moment. If you want to pause right now and think about that so that my dumb thoughts don't cloud your judgment, that might be a useful thing. Or if you listen to this with someone, maybe just hit pause and think about it together so that it's your thing and not my thing. But that said, I'm going to keep rolling. So here's my take. It seems like the point of the law and the prophets is to, one, reveal the character of God. Exactly who he is comes through in the ground rules. It comes through in his dealings with broken humanity, in his righteous judgment, in his grace, which is manifest, I think, in the sacrificial system of the Old Testament. It seems really foreign and not like grace to us, but if you think about it, like it is. He's withholding his right and just judgment of broken people who've broken his law. So I think it reveals his character. I also think that it reveals hints of the values of his kingdom, both in the parts of the law that are so obviously unfulfillable that nobody can do it, as he talks about in Matthew chapter 5 with the "you've heard it said that, but I tell you" statements. The Old Testament ceremonial law, the Old Testament civil law, even the moral law, it's all in desperate need of completion. Not because God drafted up crappy laws in the Old Testament. I mean, the latter part of the book of Hebrews points out that no, God knew what he was doing. It's about the insufficiency of us, of people. And so the law demonstrates the character of God, I think. The law points toward the values of the kingdom and the functions of the kingdom in redemption. And I think the law and the prophets and the commandments point us toward how to duplicate those values of God, those characteristics of God, in a way that we receive the good stuff from him and we give it away to other people. And some of the law seems really obtuse and detailed and like, well, why would we need to know any of that? But in the context in which that law was given historically, all of those little details that might seem picayunish and totally irrelevant to us today, they were all things that were demonstrative of the epistemological fact that stuff means stuff. And therefore, in any given culture, with any given set of technology, there are ways to say, I don't care about you, I hate you, I wish ill things on you. And there are other little things that you can do in such a society that communicate care and compassion and interest in people. And so the specific elements even of the law that seem weird and outmoded to us, still to the people they were given to, laid out what it looked like for people to be loving and imitate the character of God toward others in community, and what it looked like for people to not do that. The law is supposed to point people to God. The law is supposed to point out the deficiency and insufficiency of the game plan of having self as king. It's supposed to shake people out of the idolatry of self and bring them to a place where they bend the knee to the one true king, because there's no life in the self thing and there is life in the God thing. That's how I read it. I mean, there's more to it. I don't know. I'm kind of doing this off the cuff, but I'm assuming that you're seeing a bunch of the same themes in the text about what the law and the prophets and the commandments are supposed to do. And in a way, I suppose that's the hard part of the conversation, because then when we work further backwards into Jesus' remarks in verses 37 through 40, it's not so tough to see why you picked that passage from Deuteronomy and why you picked that passage from Leviticus. Like, love God with everything you got and love other people like yourselves. Well, there are no laws or commandments or movements of God that push you toward not love everybody else like yourself or don't love God. If one receives the love of God, is transformed by the love of God, if one receives the values of God and is transformed by that, if one bends the knee to the authority of God and says your values and your currency and all your stuff is the truest, realest, best stuff, then the only thing that makes any sense is to give that away to other people. And so from the human perspective, from our side of the equation, I think Jesus' statement really obviously checks out. I, for one, like how complicated aspects of the Bible and Christianity and historical theology are. It's reassuring to me that some of this stuff is tricky and difficult and takes a lifetime of wrestling with to even start to understand. There are aspects of it that are like that, and I would expect that to be the case when you're talking about the intersection between literally the infinite and literally the finite. Those two things shouldn't be able to coexist. I also appreciate how often Jesus and the text in general is able to boil the whole thing down to something so simple and gettable. Like this greatest commandment thing, for example. Like you might not be able to solve all the mysteries of God or figure out everything or give the final word as to what is philosophically true in the explanation of all things, but love God with everything you got and love other people as yourself? Well, if that's the bottom line of what I do in terms of my thinking and my response, that's pretty good. And all of that seems to flow out of something else that has been really neatly boiled down, which is if you think this is true and you think Jesus is God in the flesh and the Messiah and that he is initiating this kingdom and that God's kingdom is the truest, realest thing, that in whatever way you bend the knee to that king. You take some sort of that oath of fealty to say you are king and I am not, and my hope is in you and not in myself. And all of that seems to come together pretty neatly in this little interlude that looks like it's headed for a gigantic explosion, dumpster fire, train wreck, tire fire, and then it just doesn't. And instead, this beautiful, precise, theologically sharp tautology that Jesus gives in the middle of this storm with people trying to beat him down is profound and has more value than just the narrative flow that we get here. It speaks through the ages to what the point is. Fun. Thanks for gaming it out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10 Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.